Butte, Montana is booming. The population has grown nearly tenfold in just the last 20 years. But beneath the surface, tensions between the miners and the companies continued to rise. The city was a powder keg, and all it needed was one spark.
By the early 1900s, Butte was no longer a mining camp. It had become a city, built on the backs of nearly 12,000 miners, men who made up a large part of the population and powered one of the greatest mining operations in the world. But as the city grew, so did the frustration, because the men doing the work were no longer willing to accept the conditions underground. And for the first time, it felt like the balance of power might finally be shifting. But in Butte, power was never given up easily. The tensions between labor and industry continued to fester for the next decade, and things were about to turn violent.
And in 1914, that violence arrived.
In the early morning hours, an explosion ripped through the Miners' Union Hall in Butte. Dynamite, placed deliberately, detonated inside the building, killing 2 men and injuring others. It sent a shockwave through the city, because this was no accident. This was a message. And in Butte, the conflict between miners and the companies had entered a new and dangerous chapter.
And just as tensions in Butte were reaching a breaking point,
The world was pulled into war. In 1914, World War I began, and suddenly, the copper coming out of Butte was no longer just fueling industry. It was fueling a nation at war. Every wire, every shell, every signal depended on it. And with that, the stakes in Butte changed overnight. Because now, this wasn't just a fight between miners and companies. It was a fight happening in the shadow of a global war. The tension had already reached its breaking point. And then, on June 8th, 1917, a spark lit the fuse. Deep underground, a power cable had been lowered into the mine, its protective covering damaged, exposing the materials inside. And as men worked nearby, a flame from a headlamp ignited the wrapping around the cable. What started as a small fire would quickly become something far worse. The small fire began to spread, climbing along the cable, feeding on the very materials meant to protect it. And in the tight confines of the mine, it didn't take long before the smoke began to move. Thick, choking, and toxic. It filled the shafts and raced through the tunnels, reaching men who had no idea what was coming. Because in the darkness, it wasn't the flames that would claim the most lives. It was the air itself. And as the smoke spread, the realization set in that something was terribly wrong. Men dropped their tools and turned for the shafts, racing through tunnels they knew by heart, now filled with darkness and smoke. Some tried to climb ladders, stretching hundreds of feet upward. Others searched desperately for fresh air or a way out. But the deeper the smoke moved, the harder it became to see, to breathe, to think. And in those final moments, many miners did the only thing they could. They found a place, sat down together, and waited. The bodies were brought to places like Dugan Dolan Mortuary as the city struggled to keep up with the loss. As more bodies came up, there simply wasn't room for them all. So they were laid out right there in the mine yard, covered and waiting to be identified. By the time the fire was brought under control, it was already too late. More than 160 men had lost their lives, not in the flames, but in the smoke. Deep beneath the surface in tunnels they had worked for years. The worst hard rock mining disaster in American history. And in Butte, a city built on copper and the men who mined it, nothing would ever feel quite the same again. But this wasn't the only tragedy in Butte. Over the years, more than 75,000 miners entered the tunnels beneath the city, and nearly 2,500 never returned home. In 1917, Frank Little, a union organizer, arrived in Butte. He spoke out against unsafe conditions and against the war. Just weeks later, he was taken in the night, dragged through the streets, and lynched. His killers were never brought to justice, but thousands of miners lined the streets to honor him in one of the largest funeral processions the city had ever seen. And in the years that followed, the tension in Butte only grew. Strikes, protests, and rising anger pushed the city to the edge, until it all came to a head on Anaconda Road, where violence erupted and the struggle between labor and power was laid bare for all to see. Shots were fired, and when it was over, one man was dead, others were wounded. But the impact went far beyond the numbers, because in Butte, the divide between labor and power had turned deadly. Butte reached its peak of nearly 60,000 people, but the town was somber, worn down by violence. And beneath the surface, the mines were beginning to fade. The easy ore was gone, so the city began to choose a different path: negotiation instead of violence. In 1955, it was decided to mine a different way. Open pit mining came to Butte, and with it, the Berkeley Pit. Entire neighborhoods were swallowed by the mine. Meaderville, McQueen, and much of East Butte gone to the pit. Then, in 1973, the Anaconda Company made the decision to close Columbia Gardens, a place filled with childhood memories, suddenly gone. And not long after it burned to the ground, under circumstances many would later question, leaving behind only memories. Then in 1980, the mines fell silent. After nearly a century of digging, drilling, and blasting, Butte's mining era came to an end. And a city built on copper was left to find its future. High above Butte stands more than a statue. Starting as a promise by one man to build a small statue of the Virgin Mary if his wife beat cancer. Our Lady of the Rockies was built by the people as a tribute to the women of Butte and the lives shaped by this city. A reminder of sacrifice, strength, and resilience. In the years after the shutdown, Butte's mining future was uncertain, until Montana businessman Dennis Washington put his support behind Montana Resources. And now the mine runs 24/7, 365 days a year, here in the mining city, the richest hill on Earth.